Hello. My article talked about the effects of high-intensity interval training versus steady-state training on aerobic and anaerobic capacity. The authors were Carl Foster, Courtney Farland, Flavia Guddiotti, Michelle Harbin, Brianna Roberts, Jeff Shutt, Andrew Turi, Scott Doberstein, John Percari, and the article was published in November of 2015. And so a quick overview here. Basically, they had three different groups of participants, and it's important to note here that the study used sedentary college-age males and females, and we'll come back to why that's important towards the end. So they had three different groups, and they ran them through an 8-week conditioning program, and then wanted to look at the different effects on aerobic and anaerobic capacity. So the first group, we'll call the steady-state group. They did 20 minutes of constant exercise at 90% of their ventilatory threshold. And from what I could find, ventilatory threshold is the same as lactate threshold 1. So basically 90% of VT is right before that first lactate threshold point that we talked about in class. So the second group, which they called the Meyer group, just based on who came up with the stipulants for how hard they worked during that. They did 13 sets of 30 seconds on, and they did 100% of their peak aerobic power during that 30 seconds. And then they got 1 minute of active recovery, which was resistance-less spinning on a bike for a total of 20 minutes. So 30 seconds on, a minute off for 20 minutes. Same as the steady state group, which was also 20 minutes. The third group, which we're going to compare to like high intensity interval training, which our book talked about, is the Tabata group. And they did 20 seconds on at 170% of their aerobic power. And then they got 10 seconds off with unloaded pedaling or resistance-less pedaling. And they did 8 sets, so only a total of 4 minutes compared to the other two groups where they had 20 minutes. The major findings of this study were that the first one was at exercise enjoyment scale. So they had all of the participants rate how much they enjoyed the exercise before, during, and after each session. And the enjoyment scale went down for all three exercise groups, but it went down more for the high intensity interval training or the Tabata group. We'll come back to that more. The second major finding was that there was an increase in aerobic and anaerobic capacity for all three groups, which is important. And the third finding, which kind of ties back to the second one, was that there was no difference between the amount of improvement between the three groups. So to relate this to the book, we know that on page 61 it talks about HIIT, and it says that HIIT provided performance and physiological adaptations equivalent to those of long, slow endurance training, but in a time-efficient manner, which we see in this study. We see only 4 minutes of work provides the same amount of adaptation as the groups that do 20 minutes of work, whether it be 20 minutes of steady state or 20 minutes of interval training, but longer rests and lower intensities. The other thing that's interesting is that a lot of studies find that high-intensity interval training produces better aerobic improvements than steady state, but we didn't find that in this study. And some of the reasons they mentioned for not finding that could be due to the duration or the design of the HIIT intervals. And then what I think is the most important piece here that they talked about is we see difference in HIIT outcomes or improvements, but based on whether the subjects are sedentary or active. And so in this group, we did sedentary subjects. And in class, we talked about how if we take any kind of athlete if they're sedentary, and then put them, they're going to see improvements in any kind of program right away. And so here I'll just put up a picture with the different summary of the improvements for the groups. And you can see that the high intensity interval training did produce the best increase in overall capacity increase, but it was not statistically significant compared to the increase of the other two groups. So my take-home 3 main points are that In sedentary individuals, HIIT and steady state training produce the same amount of increase in aerobic and anaerobic, and not necessarily the exact same, but it wasn't statistically significantly different. My second point is that HIIT is a way to save time and still get improvements in performance. And the third point is that HIIT may have a lower enjoyment score, and so that it is very important to use HIIT with athletes that are committed to the program and not necessarily people who are just getting into exercise because it may drive them away from exercise. Thanks for listening.